The music was still pounding inside Ibiza's world-famous Pacha nightclub when Spanish police slipped through the crowd. At first glance, Eddie Burton looked like any other British tourist, young, baby-faced, dressed for the night. But in reality, he was one of the UK's most wanted traffickers. The 23-year-old had built a £20 million drug pipeline, moving cocaine, heroin, and ketamine from Europe into Britain. And alongside him stood Sian, his former partner turned accomplice, who prosecutors later described as a glamorous gangster's mole, but who investigators knew was far more than just decoration. Together they ran a smuggling operation that stretched from modified fuel tanks to encrypted messaging apps designed to flood UK streets with Class A drugs. Burton left fingerprints and DNA on huge consignments seized at Dover. Banks handled logistics, laundered profits, and even dealt in counterfeit COVID documents when borders were closed. But in August 2022, their empire collapsed. Arrested abroad, dragged into the spotlight, and finally sentenced in a British courtroom. Their downfall became a textbook example of how greed and ambition can tear down two lives. This is the story of Eddie Burton and Sian and the £20 million drug empire that ended in handcuffs. He didn't look like the architect of a multi-million pound drug empire. At 23, Eddie Burton was baby-faced, often mistaken for a teenager, the kind of figure you'd expect to see on a cheap holiday flight, rather than at the top of a trafficking network. But in the summer of 2022, investigators discovered that appearances could be fatally deceptive. Burton had built connections across Europe, particularly in Spain and the Netherlands, two hubs for the cocaine trade. Using encrypted messaging apps, he coordinated shipments designed to push massive amounts of Class A and Class B drugs onto Britain's streets. His logistics were bold, lorries arriving at Dover with fuel tanks modified to carry concealed packages. The National Crime Agency later described his operation as sophisticated, but his own fingerprints and DNA left on parcels and panels told a different story. By his side was Sian, 25 years old, who prosecutors insisted was not just a passive partner. She helped launder money, arrange travel, and even ran a sideline in forged COVID-19 travel documents during the pandemic. At first, Banks had been described in headlines as a gangster's mole, a glamorous figure in the shadows of Burton's empire. But as detectives dug deeper, it became clear she had direct involvement in the smuggling pipeline. Court records later showed she had personally smuggled drugs inside her luggage on two separate occasions in August 2022. Their relationship blurred the line between romance and criminal partnership. Burton and Banks were no longer a couple when the arrests came, but during the height of their operation, their bond gave the enterprise both ambition and reach. She traveled repeatedly to the Netherlands and Spain, visiting Burton as he coordinated shipments. For investigators, those movements were crucial threads, linking the UK end of the conspiracy to the European supply chain. The first breakthrough came on the 3rd of July 2022. Border Force officers at Dover searched a lorry and discovered 90 kilograms of ketamine and 50 kilograms of cocaine hidden inside an adapted fuel tank. Forensic specialists soon matched Burton's fingerprints to packaging in the load. The find set alarm bells ringing. Here was a 23-year-old whose DNA was on a consignment worth millions. And yet just 6 weeks later, another lorry attempted the same route. This time, officers uncovered 142 kilograms of cocaine and 25 kilograms of heroin. Again, Burton's DNA was on the concealment. Again, the method pointed back to his network. For investigators, the message was clear. Burton was not dabbling in smuggling. He was orchestrating serious wholesale imports. The National Crime Agency, NCA, soon began to close the net. Operation teams pieced together his communications, his travel links, and the fingerprints that tied him directly to the cargo. In one recovered message, dated 5th July 2022, Burton even joked about the risk of leaving prints, telling a contact that you've never been nicked or had your prints took anyway, so doesn't matter. To detectives, it showed not only his awareness of the danger, but also his arrogance. What they didn't know yet was where Burton was hiding, As the lorries were stopped and consignments seized, the young trafficker had already slipped abroad. He was no longer in Liverpool or Manchester, he was living under an alias, blending into the party scenes of Spain. But the walls were closing in. The scale of the operation revealed itself in the summer of 2022. The first truck arrived at the port of Dover on the 3rd of July. To the naked eye, it looked routine. Another long-haul vehicle coming through the gateway that handles thousands of journeys every day. But something caught the attention of Border Force officers. The lorry's fuel tank looked tampered with, the bolts not quite factory standard, the seal not sitting flush. When officers began their search, they quickly found what they suspected: concealed packages inside a hollowed-out tank. Inside were 90 kilograms of ketamine and 50 kilograms of cocaine. On the street, the haul was worth millions. It wasn't the biggest seizure Dover had seen that year, but the concealment method suggested a professional network. And yet, what stunned investigators came after the initial find. Forensic testing uncovered fingerprints and DNA directly linking the consignment to Eddie Burton. Normally, organizers of drug shipments kept their hands clean. Packaging, vehicles, and concealments would be handled by layers of couriers and fixers. For Burton's DNA to appear not just once, but later again, would become his undoing. 6 weeks later, 12th August 2022, it happened again. Another lorry, another suspicious tank. This time, officers unearthed 142 kilograms of cocaine and 25 kilograms of heroin. The seizure dwarfed the first, bringing the combined total to more than 20 million pounds worth of drugs. And again, Burton's fingerprints and DNA were found on key concealment panels. To the National Crime Agency, the message was clear. This wasn't an isolated shipment. Burton was orchestrating large-scale trafficking. The method was familiar: modified tanks, concealments that mirrored the earlier load. He was repeating the same trick, confident enough to assume lightning wouldn't strike twice. But the forensic evidence told investigators they were dealing with someone careless, even arrogant. Burton's own words in a message from the 5th of July underlined that. "You've never been nicked, or had your prints took anyway, so it doesn't matter," he told an associate. The line, later revealed in court, summed up his approach: bold, reckless, convinced the system couldn't touch him. Sian Banks's involvement became clearer too. Passenger records showed she traveled repeatedly between the UK, the Netherlands, and Spain during that same summer. Surveillance and intelligence linked her to visits with Burton while he was abroad. Prosecutors later demonstrated that she wasn't just visiting for leisure, she was part of the operation, smuggling drugs in her luggage twice in August 2022. Alongside that, she ran a sideline selling doctored COVID travel documents, exploiting the chaos of the pandemic for extra profit. For investigators, the picture now sharpened. Burton was the logistics mastermind tied directly to the consignments by fingerprints and DNA. Banks was the fixer and courier, bridging the gap between Europe and the UK. Together they formed a partnership that blurred lines of crime, travel, and finance. The seizures gave authorities the leverage they needed. But there was one problem. Burton wasn't in Britain anymore. By the time the second lorry was seized, he had already gone to ground in Europe. Under an alias, he blended into the sun-soaked chaos of Spain's party islands, where thousands of young Brits went every summer to dance until sunrise. He thought he had escaped the spotlight, but investigators were already tracking his movements, working with Spanish authorities, and waiting for the moment he would surface. That moment came in August 2023, under the strobe lights of one of Ibiza's most famous clubs. By the time British investigators had tied Eddie Burton to 2 multi-million-pound consignments at Dover, he was no longer in the country. The fingerprints and DNA had given detectives their man, but their target was already across Europe, living under an alias and hiding in plain sight. Burton had slipped into Spain, moving through the Netherlands and Germany along the way. Spain was more than just a holiday destination for him, it was a hub. The cocaine routes from Latin America fed into Spanish ports before dispersing across Europe. For Burton, it was the perfect place to vanish and keep his connections alive. But investigators weren't blind. Working alongside Europol and Spanish police, the National Crime Agency traced Burton's movements. Passenger manifests showed him traveling under false details. Banks, too, had made trips abroad to see him, shuttling between Britain, the Netherlands, and Spain. What looked like a glamorous lifestyle on the surface was, in reality, part of an international smuggling conspiracy. The break came in August 2023, when Spanish authorities learned Burton was in Ibiza, not hiding in a remote villa, not disguised in the back streets, but walking brazenly into one of the island's most famous clubs, Pacha, a venue where thousands packed in under flashing lights and pounding music. Spanish officers moved quietly. The goal wasn't to create panic, but to extract their target before he slipped away. They entered the club, weaving through the crowd, eyes locked on the baby-faced Brit who thought he'd escaped the UK dragnet. Burton didn't run. Witnesses later described him as calm, even indifferent, as if he couldn't believe the net had finally tightened. The music thundered around him as officers closed in. Under the strobe lights, he was placed in handcuffs and led out into the night. For investigators, the arrest was the climax of months of painstaking work. But the job wasn't over. Burton was held in Spain, where his defense tried to resist extradition. From Ibiza, he was moved to Germany as part of the European arrest warrant process, before finally being flown back to Britain. The young trafficker, who had once joked about his fingerprints not mattering, was now facing the full weight of the UK courts. Sian Banks' fate was sealed shortly afterwards. Evidence showed she had made multiple trips abroad to support Burton, including personal smuggling runs. She was arrested in the UK and faced her own list of charges. Prosecutors would later argue that Banks wasn't just a glamorous accessory. She was a willing participant, laundering money, carrying drugs, and profiting from the empire Burton had built. The pair's arrests marked the end of a transnational chase that spanned from Dover to Ibiza. For the National Crime Agency, it was proof that even younger criminals who saw themselves as untouchable behind encrypted apps and cheap flights could still be tracked and taken down. Burton's calm demeanor at the nightclub was the last moment he could pretend to be in control. Once extradited, once placed in a British cell, the reality became unavoidable. The charges against him carried sentences stretching decades. And as the case moved toward trial, the shocking details of just how deep their conspiracy ran would come spilling out in open court. When Eddie Burton was escorted out of Pacha nightclub in Ibiza, the National Crime Agency already had a mountain of evidence against him. But building a watertight case meant tracing every thread, from seized consignments to encrypted chats, from fingerprints to financial trails. The investigation had begun with those two seizures at Dover in July and August 2022. Forensic officers were stunned at how directly Burton had tied himself to the drugs. Packaging bore his DNA, concealment panels carried his fingerprints, and in one case, tools used to adapt the lorry fuel tank also connected back to him. It was unusual. Major traffickers usually operated at arm's length. Burton had been hands-on, perhaps out of arrogance, perhaps out of inexperience. Either way, it gave the prosecution something rare, irrefutable physical evidence. But the digital trail was just as damning. A recovered message from the 5th of July 2022 became a centerpiece in court. In it, Burton joked about the risk of fingerprints, telling a contact, "You've never been nicked or had your prints took anyway, so it doesn't matter." It was the kind of offhand arrogance that, once read aloud to a jury, stripped away any suggestion of accident. He knew the risks. He chose to ignore them. Then there was the money. Burton's operation wasn't only about moving drugs, it was about shifting profits. And that's where Sian Banks came in. Banks laundered funds through accounts, prepared transactions, and acted as a go-between. Court records showed that she also traveled to meet Burton while he was abroad, to the Netherlands, to Spain, trips prosecutors argued were directly connected to the smuggling pipeline. And even more striking, Banks had run a side scam during the pandemic. Investigators uncovered evidence that she doctored COVID-19 travel documents and sold them to others, trying to bypass restrictions. In the confusion of 2020 and 2021, such scams had become a lucrative black market. For Banks, it was another way to exploit a crisis for cash. To prosecutors, it was proof of her criminal mindset. Travel records placed Banks on 2 separate smuggling runs in August 2022, carrying drugs in her luggage. Combined with her laundering role, it painted a picture of someone deeply involved, far more than the glamorous gangster's mole headlines suggested. In the eyes of the court, she was a partner. The NCA built its case layer by layer. Passenger data showed Burton's movements under false identities. Surveillance logs charted banks' visits abroad. Financial records mapped deposits and withdrawals consistent with laundering. And the drugs themselves, ketamine, cocaine, heroin, provided the hard currency of the conspiracy. By the time Burton was extradited from Germany to the UK in late 2023, prosecutors had a file thick enough to guarantee conviction. He faced 4 counts of importing Class A and B drugs. Banks, arrested in Britain, faced 7 charges, including importing Class A drugs and money laundering. Both eventually pleaded guilty, though not before months of pre-trial wrangling. What emerged in court wasn't just the story of 2 young people caught in the thrill of quick money. It was the anatomy of a £20 million pipeline stretching from Europe into Britain, designed to flood streets with drugs. The Dover seizures were only the consignments that got caught. How many others slipped through remains an open question. For the NCA, the case became a showcase, proof that even in a landscape of encrypted apps, international borders, and false identities, traditional methods still mattered: fingerprints, DNA, and patient detective work. For Burton and Banks, it meant the dream of fast riches had collapsed into reality: a courtroom, a guilty plea, and the certainty of prison. When Eddie Burton finally stood in a British courtroom, the illusion of control he once carried had vanished. Gone was the baby-faced partygoer who slipped into Ibiza's nightlife under an alias. In his place stood a 23-year-old man facing the consequences of a £20 million drug conspiracy that spanned borders and left forensic proof at every stage. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They laid out the Dover seizures in painstaking detail: the modified fuel tanks, the concealed kilograms of cocaine, heroin, and ketamine, the fingerprints and DNA that placed Burton at the heart of both consignments. Jurors heard how he had joked in messages about fingerprints not mattering, a line that now rang hollow as those very prints sealed his conviction. Attention also turned to Sian Banks. The headlines had branded her the glamorous mole, but prosecutors showed her true role: a courier who had smuggled drugs in her luggage on 2 occasions, a money launderer moving illicit profits, and a scammer who forged COVID-19 travel documents during the pandemic. Far from passive, Banks had been an active partner, traveling across Europe to support Burton and keep the pipeline alive. Faced with the weight of evidence, both Burton and Banks entered guilty pleas. Burton admitted 4 counts of importing Class A and B drugs. Banks admitted 7 charges, including importing Class A drugs and money laundering. When sentencing came, the judge did not hold back. Addressing Burton, the court described his operation as sophisticated, deliberate, and motivated by greed. At just 23, he had already chosen to build a network designed to pump Class A drugs into British streets. The judge underlined that the quantities involved were not small-scale or opportunistic, but commercial shipments worth tens of millions. Banks, too, was condemned for her active role. The court heard how she had made calculated choices to join Burton in the conspiracy, profiting from his connections and committing crimes in her own right. Her forged COVID documentation scheme showed, in the judge's words, a willingness to exploit crisis for personal gain. In total, the pair were handed sentences that reflected the seriousness of their crimes. Burton, the ringleader, received a prison term stretching into decades. Banks, though slightly less culpable, was also given a significant custodial sentence. Together they left the dock knowing they would spend much of their young adulthood behind bars. For the National Crime Agency, the convictions were a victory. Spokespersons emphasized that this was not just another smuggling case, but proof that organized criminals could be caught even when they crossed borders and hid behind aliases. Fingerprints, DNA, financial records, and cooperation between UK, German, and Spanish authorities had delivered justice. The case also sent a message to others. Burton had thought his age, his false identities, and his charm would shield him. He believed that encrypted phones and party island hideouts would keep him untouchable. Instead, his downfall became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even baby-faced traffickers could not outrun the system forever. As the press covered their sentences, the photographs told their own story. Burton, once smug in Ibiza's nightlife, now wore the look of a man staring at years behind bars. Banks, who had posted polished images online, now faced the harsh reality of a cell. In the end, the story of Eddie Burton and Sian Banks was not one of glamour or escape, but of greed, recklessness, and collapse. They had tried to build a criminal empire worth millions. Instead, they built a trail of evidence that led directly to their conviction. And for Britain's courts, that trail ended exactly where it should, with the clang of a prison door.